Hello again. On October the 5th began and on December the 28th ended in 1970 a major political crisis known as the October Crisis in Canada. It involved a group of extremist Quebec separatists known as the Front pour la Libération du Québec, Quebec Liberation Front, who kidnapped first the British High Trade Commissioner for Canada, James Cross, who was released 2 months later. And several days after kidnapping him, some of those terrorists kidnapped the Quebec province's Labour Minister, Pierre Laporte, who was playing football with his nephew on his front lawn. Laporte tragically was strangled to death. After this crisis began, the Quebec Premier or Provincial Prime Minister Robert Bourassa and a fellow Liberal politician, the Canadian Prime Minister and head of government and the country's executive leader, Pierre Trudeau, as well as the Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau, all supported giving the government, the Quebec government and the Canadian federal government special powers to combat or to fight against this terrorism. And so the Canadian Justice Minister, John Turner, had the thankless task of introducing the War Measures Act in the Canadian House of Commons, which passed. The Liberals, after all, had a safe majority there, and it was also approved by the Senate. According to opinion polls, most Canadians approved of the temporary curtailment of civil liberties because they considered them necessary in order to prevent more public officials and indeed private citizens from being abducted. Early during the crisis, so still in October 1970, Tim Ralph, a reporter of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is Canada's public sector broadcasting company, was waiting for Pierre Trudeau as the Prime Minister stepped out of his limousine in Ottawa and then started to interview him informally. And he said that he was concerned about these gun-wielding soldiers being around Ottawa. And at one point, he asked the Prime Minister, "How far are you willing to go, sir?" Flippantly, Prime Minister Trudeau answered, "Just watch me." And this was considered by a number of the critics of Prime Minister Trudeau as an example of his arrogant attitude towards ordinary people, including journalists. Indeed, one of his most unflattering biographies that I even looked at many years ago in the Helsinki University's English department's library, or one of the library rooms, was called Shrug. Like symbolizing his indifference towards those who are suffering. He was a highly intellectual and academic person, and contrary to his predecessor Lester Pearson, who seemed like a polite chairman of the board or professor, indeed he had been a professor before his political career, he sometimes was openly arrogant. For example, once he asked a protester at a Liberal campaign or political rally, "Well, why should I sell the Canadian farmers wheat?" And early in his prime ministership, he mockingly said, "When they are 50 yards away from Parliament, meaning the Canadian Federal Parliament in Ottawa, they are no longer honorable members, they are just nobodies." He addressed the nation on CBC television and said that the powers were distasteful but necessary for the time being, and that they would be dismantled as soon as possible. So the Canadian government had the right to send police officers and soldiers to arrest without a warrant people who were suspected of being involved in this terrorist movement in some way. However, they, of course, had a right during detention to a lawyer, and eventually relatively few people, if I remember correctly, only 5 people from my reading of Kenneth McNaughton's The Penguin History of Canada were convicted of either being involved directly or indirectly with this terrorist plot. I'm not sure if this contributed 2 years later, in October 1972, to Trudeau's near defeat in the 1972 Canadian federal elections, where the Liberals returned to office with just 2 seats more than the main opposition party, then called the Progressive Conservatives. And Trudeau had to then reach out to the Social Democratic, New Democratic Party in order to remain in power with his weak minority government in the House of Commons. Then in the spring of 1974, the New Democrats joined the Progressive Conservatives in voting against Trudeau's proposed budget, which triggered the July 1974 Canadian parliamentary elections, federal parliamentary elections, which then the Liberals won, albeit with a reduced majority compared to the 1968 election results. There was no lasting benefit to the terrorists advocating Quebec's independence through violence. Rather, this event probably strengthened the more moderate wings of the Quebec independence movement, especially the Parti Québécois, although it would be 6 more years before that party was able to oust the Liberals and form a new provincial government. So the police were enabled with far-reaching powers, and they arrested and detained without bail 497 individuals, only 62 of whom were later released. Only 62 of them were charged with 1 or more offenses. From 1963 to 1970, the Quebec nationalist group Front de Libération du Québec had detonated over 950 bombs, while mailboxes, especially in the affluent and predominantly English-speaking city of Westmount in Montreal, in the Montreal region, common targets. The largest single bombing was of the Montreal Stock Exchange in February 1969, which injured 27 people as well as extensively damaging the stock exchange. Other targets included Montreal City Hall, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is the Canadian federal police organization and also serves as the provincial police in 6 of the 10 Canadian provinces. The T. Eaton Company department store, armed forces recruiting offices, railway tracks, and army installations. By 1970, 23 members of the Front de Libération du Québec were in prison, including 4 convicted of murder. On February the 26th, 1970, 2 men in a panel truck, including Jacques Lanctot, were arrested in Montreal when they were discovered with a sawed-off shotgun and a communiqué announcing the kidnapping of the Israeli consul. In June 1970, police raided a home in the small community of Prévost, north of Montreal, in the Laurentian Mountains, and found firearms, ammunition, and 140 kilograms or 300 pounds of dynamite, detonators, and the draft of a ransom note to be used in the kidnapping of the US consul. So the crisis began on October the 5th, when in Montreal, Quebec, the British diplomat James Cross was kidnapped from his home. The kidnappers were disguised as delivery men bringing in a package for his recent birthday. The maid let them in, and then they pulled out a rifle and a revolver and kidnapped Cross. This was followed by a communiqué to the authorities containing the kidnappers' demands, which included the exchange of Cross for political prisoners, meaning fellow FLQers, a number of convicted or detained FLQ members, and the CBC broadcast of the FLQ manifesto. Although the terms of the ransom note were the same as those found in June of that year, for the US consul's planned kidnapping, the police did not connect the two. On October the 8th, so 3 days later, the FLQ manifesto was broadcast in all French and English-speaking media outlets in Quebec. On October the 10th, members of the Chenier cell approached the home of the deputy premier of the province of Quebec, as well as the labor minister, Pierre Laporte, and he was picked up forcibly from his front lawn where he was playing football with his nephew. On October the 11th, the CBC broadcast a letter from captivity from Pierre Laporte addressed to the Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa. On October the 12th, General Gilles Turcot sent troops from the Royal 22e Regiment or Royal 22nd Regiment to guard federal property in the Montreal region at the request of the federal government. The FLQ appointed a lawyer named Robert Lemieux to negotiate the release of James Cross and Pierre Laporte, while the Quebec government appointed Robert Demer. And the Just Watch Me interview occurred in Ottawa on October the 13th. On October the 14th, 16 prominent Quebec personalities, including René Lévesque, who was the chairperson of the Parti Québécois, the non-violent pro-independence left-wing Quebec party, and Claude Ryan, who was a liberal Quebec politician, demanded negotiations to exchange the two hostages for the political prisoners. FLQ's lawyer Robert Lemieux urged the Université FLQ. On October the 15th, in Quebec City, the negotiations between lawyers Lemieux and Demer ended. And the Quebec government formally requested the intervention of the Canadian Army in aid of the civil power pursuant to the National Defence Act. On October the 16th, Premier Bourassa formally requested that Canada's federal government grant the Quebec provincial government emergency powers to allow them to apprehend and keep in custody individuals. On October the 17th, the Chenier cell of the FLQ announced that hostage Pierre Laporte had been executed. He indeed had been strangled and then stuffed in the trunk of a car and abandoned in the bush near Saint-Hubert Airport, a few miles or some kilometers from Montreal. October the 18th, while denouncing the acts of subversion and terrorism, both of which are so tragically contrary to the best interests of our people, René Lévesque criticized the War Measures Act. On November the 6th, police raided the hiding place of the FLQ's Chenier cell. 3 members were able to escape the raid, but Bernard Lortie was arrested and charged with the kidnapping and murder of Pierre Laporte. And finally, on December the 4th, James Cross was released by the FLQ Liberation Cell after negotiations between lawyers Bernard Merglet and Robert Demer. Kidnappers Marc Carbonneau, after the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro had approved their entry to that country. On December the 23rd, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau announced that all troops stationed in Quebec would be withdrawn by January the 5th, 1971. On December the 28th, in Saint-Luc, Quebec, the 3 members of the Chenier cell still at large, Paul Rose, Jacques Rose, and Francis Simard, were arrested after being found hiding in a 6-meter tunnel in a rural farming community. Later, they would be charged with the kidnapping and murder of Pierre Laporte. Eventually, the War Measures Act was replaced by the Public Order Act. By 1982, all the convicted participants had been paroled, and all of those sent to Cuba had returned to Canada, some completing short sentences in Canada. So in 1988, the War Measures Act was replaced. Then the federal government was formed by the Progressive Conservatives under former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, by the Emergencies Act and the Emergency Preparedness Act. Numerous documentaries and movies have been released of this crisis, including Active and Reaction, A Portrait of a Society in Crisis. Robin Spry produced these documentary films released in 1973. Les Ordres, or The Orders, a historical film drama directed in 1974. Then Octobre, a movie shot in 1994 by Quebec director Pierre Falardeau. Then Black October in 2000, produced by CBC Television. This documentary lasted 2 hours. La Belle Province, the beautiful province, which is Quebec's nickname, in 2001. L'Otage, or the hostage, in 2004. Tout le monde en parlait. Everyone talked about it. La crise d'Octobre 1 by Radio-Canada, the French language equivalent of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in 2010. An 8-part mini-series about some of the incidents of the October crisis, titled October 1970, was released in October 2006. And finally, Just Watch Me, a Trudeau musical, a play produced in 2015 at the Vancouver Fringe Festival.